If you are planning on pulling for Vivian, you might have a few questions. Which teams does she excel in? Does she play differently in some of her teams? Do her builds change depending on the team? So let me answer these questions for you today. I have tested her in 6 different Anomaly teams in various layouts and with various support, so let's talk about the performance and how they compare to their other options, as well as their pros, cons and caveats for their respective teams. If you're interested in how to play Vivian or her best build, check out my guide on her right here. Let's waste no time any further and let's get one thing out of the way, because whether you like it or not, it is a common occurrence between basically all teams I have tested. Astra. Vivian really wants Astra, and that is less because of Astra's buffs, the quick assists or of the chain attacks she provides, but because her quick assists trigger her tremolos, which deal EX special damage at the low cost of 25 energy and do in fact trigger Vivian's feather blooms. Vivian's damage is highly reliant on how well you can spend and manage her guard feather stacks, and without Astra you might find yourself in a situation where you are simply stuck on having her stacks but no way of spending them. This is not only a noticeable damage loss, but also just pretty frustrating to play. That does not mean she is unplayable or anything without Astra, but the difference between having Astra in the team and, well, literally any other support or stunner in the entire game is honestly pretty noticeable, especially in terms of how smooth and simply satisfying the team feels. Because sitting on her guard feather stacks with no way of spending them, you know, it just feels bad. Anyway, all runs included in my tests are only the very first runs I did. No resets whatsoever. But I did play all of the teams at least once before in Geo to practice her basic rotations and to not go in completely blind. Let's start with Jane, because I do think Jane is her best DPS partner. We will compare Vivian to Bernice in the same team, and with Jane, Bernice and Astra I got 36,000 versus Pompeii. This is the baseline we will compare against. Running Jane with Time Weaver, Astra on Kaboom R5 for the additional energy regeneration, and Vivian with Anomaly Mastery in slot 6, I achieved 42,000 on the very first try, which is in fact nearly 20% above Bernice, and that is considering that Pompeii does neither have a physical nor an ether weakness. Pretty fucking good. The team honestly played itself quite well, but that is also because of the matchup. Pompeii provides a lot of parry opportunities, which helps her guard feather generation pretty massively, as we can parry into assist follow-up quite frequently when we are running out. This is something other matchups, such as the Corruption Complex, are missing, and while Vivian's performance is in those other matchups still very good, she is now much more reliant on Astra and the quick assists, but more on that later. I then also tested attack percent on Vivian instead of Anomaly Mastery in slot 6, and the difference was minimal, about 1.5% worse than running Anomaly Mastery on her, and that matches my calculations, which honestly made me pretty happy. However, running AM just felt a lot smoother, which is why I would recommend it over attack percent. However, the actual difference in results is negligible compared to the error of play. I then also tested Time Weaver on Vivian and found it to be about even with Bernice, which did again match my calculations, which is about 15% worse than running her signature. Lastly, I also tested Caesar instead of Astra, and if you look at the B-roll footage right now, you will notice the significant difference in how well Vivian's stacks are spent compared to Astra. Sure, I could and honestly should have parried much more often with Caesar, which would have led to more EX specials from her, but the difference is still quite noticeable regardless. This comes on top of Vivian not having Caesar's buff most of the time, which results in a score about 18% lower than our Bernice baseline. Since I also know it will appear in the comments, yes, of course you can use Lucy or Nicole, but if Caesar already performs worse, they will not be that much better either. For Nicole specifically, that is because her Anomaly build-up actually messes quite a bit with Vivian's build-up, and also the corruption damage, but more importantly, Vivian's blooms do not snapshot the enemy stats when the anomaly is applied, which means the damage dealt by a bloom takes the current enemy stats into account. TLDR here being, to optimize a bloom's damage, you need to have Nicole's Death Shred active the moment a bloom is triggered and also when the anomaly is applied. And while that is possible, it is just very annoying on one hand, very energy intensive on the second time, and while you can optimize it, I certainly personally do not have the patience or interest in doing that. But feel free to do it if you have. Speaking of Nicole, let's talk about Miyabi. I know that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, using Miyabi with Yanagi and Astra against Springer, I have achieved 45k, and if we compare that to a Miyabi, Vivian, Astra team, I achieved nearly 44k using Anomaly Mastery on Miyabi, which is not much worse than Yanagi. But it also is not much better. The main difference between playing Yanagi versus Vivian in a Miyabi team comes from the amount of disorders you funnel into Miyabi. While you still get a good amount of disorders from Miyabi using Vivian, it is unmatched compared to what Yanagi provides, which makes sense because her entire fucking kit is built around disorders. I also think my score with Yanagi is hence actually low because I often simply wasted some stacks because of how many stacks this team generates for Miyabi, which is not a problem using Vivian however. Which means the ceiling for Yanagi is probably higher, however it is also a little bit harder to play simply because you might waste some stacks. Whether you are using attack or AM in slot 6 on Miyabi did not actually make too much of a difference, at least for me, with attack being just a little bit lower. Personally, I felt AM on Miyabi was simply much more comfortable, but the actual difference again is much more reliant on error in play rather than the main stat. Using Nicole, I achieved a measly 31k, which is nearly 30% worse than Astra, and if you look at the footage you know why. I sat on so many guard feathers for such long times that sometimes Vivian did essentially forget her feather blooms even exist in the first place. Nicole already contributing to the aforementioned problem of how her defense shred interacts with a bloom did not help here either, and so do my skill issues not, but again, I am sure you can optimize this. Personally not a big fan. The exact same problem I also ran into when using Trigger, and I actually blame this score more so on my choice of lineup, as Trigger's quick assist went back to Vivian instead of Miyabi, which really fucked with my brain quite a bit. But the rule stands, only first tries, and the amount of disorders and anomaly procs I got from that team have been basically non-existing, which is why I personally would not recommend it, but it is a possibility if your only goal is to clear. But again, Miyabi can also clear solo, so yeah. Generally, Vivian is a good replacement for Yanagi and Miyabi teams, although Yanagi itself also really likes Vivian. So let's talk about Yanagi. We will compare her to Trigger, and with our baseline of Yanagi, Trigger and Astra, I got 40k against the unknown corruption complex, which I will call UCC going forwards. Using Vivian in Trigger's spot did result in a whooping 46k, which is 14% higher than Trigger, and the team felt overall very smooth to play. I think it is important to note that Vivian in itself does not actually contribute that much damage by herself, at least compared to Jane, as the scalar on her Shocker Blooms is not as high, but she provides corruption which helps Yanagi trigger additional disorders, which is not the case when playing her with Trigger. Using Nicole instead of Astra did yet again perform worse, which is A due to skill issues and B also partially due to the previously mentioned issues with how Nicole's Death Shred interacts with the bloom. However, I did not feel it was as bad in this team as it was versus the other teams. However, now that I actually think about it, and this part is funnily enough not in the script, I think that might be because UCC actually has an ether weakness, and the problem is with the ether weakness you have additional build-up which might actually solve a little bit this problem where the Nicole build-up messes with Vivian's build-up. I think that might be it. I'm actually not too sure on this, but that might be a reason why it didn't feel as bad. Anyway, back to the script. Using Trigger instead of Astra performed about even with our baseline, and for this team specifically, Vivian seems more of a side grade to, funnily enough, Astra than an actual upgrade to the team. But that also means it would free Astra from this team for your other teams, and as we know, basically everyone wants Astra nowadays, so this is a positive in my book at least. For Piper, both the initial EX cast as well as the slam down at the end can trigger Vivian's blooms, which is honestly fantastic. The main problem I ran into has been simply that Pompey is so aggressive that I found myself finding a spot to actually channel Piper's EX special a little bit difficult, and since I have not played Piper since I did her guide, which was in like August last year, I was also pretty rusty on her and missed many opportunities to shorten her wind-up time for her EX special. I am sure if you optimize Piper's gameplay here, she can score much better. I also found time refill on Piper here being better than Piper's signature, but generally speaking, Vivian seems to do just as well for Piper as she does for Jane. I wanted to actually compare Piper to her somewhat more free-to-play relatable team with Bernice and Lucy, and Vivian seems to do about as well as Bernice. However, I also recorded the Bernice run much later, so I already had a better grasp on how to play Piper. I am also much more comfortable playing with Bernice than Vivian, so that certainly also played into my favor. Regardless, Vivian is great with Piper and the team feels really good to play, however it is also simply, it honestly is like Jane. Yo, post-editing riff here. It is 5:30 AM and for some reason the birds are awake, I am not, but anyway. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on Piper, specifically the part where both the initial EX cast as well as the slam down at the end can trigger Vivian's blooms, because that essentially means that Piper is pretty self-sufficient in terms of triggering said blooms, and that in turn again means that this team is much less reliant on Astra than the other teams. Astra is probably still the best support here, but now that is less due to her EX cost and more so due to the buffs she provides. For Grace, I actually don't have a baseline, and while I know that will piss some people off and write it in the comments, outside of maybe being a shock bot for Hadomasa, I would simply consider Grace pretty bad. Vivian, however, makes at least her playable. Mind you, it is much worse than Yanagi, but it works, and while I don't think Grace itself is a great unit, the team did feel pretty smooth to play. I have to give her that. Compared to Trigger Vivian at least, she seems like she is the new best and slot teammate for Grace. And lastly, let's talk about triple anomaly teams such as Jane, Bernice and Vivian. Generally, I would not recommend these teams because of an inherent mechanic within ZZZ. The game has an internal cooldown of 3 seconds in between anomaly procs, which means if you trigger any anomaly, for example assault, you cannot proc any more anomalies within the next 3 seconds. Ultimates do actually circumvent this ICD, but especially in triple anomaly teams, you will find your anomaly bars quite often just sitting at their full anomaly and not progressing for a while. That doesn't mean it is unplayable, it simply is just something I would not necessarily recommend. In my test I got 23k versus Pompey, which has been much lower than any other one. However, I also ran time refill on Bernice, which also led to some energy problems for her, so that might be something, I'm not sure. With that, we are at the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked the video, leave a comment on why Vivian is so fucking cute, and see you next time. Peace.